So welcome everyone. My name's Chris Galvin. I'm the head of communications and outreach at ICoCA, and I will be acting as our moderator for today, as Lisa Riley is unfortunately not able to be with us. She's been struck down with flu, so we wish her a speedy recovery. So thank you for joining us today for this important launch event where we'll be discussing the new report coming out from ICoCA and GISF on private security contracting in the humanitarian sector. We have interpretation during today's event, so unless you are bilingual French and English, please select your language using the globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We are waiting for our final panelist to arrive, who is French speaking, so hopefully he will be joining us. Today's session is in webinar format, which means we can't see you and we can't hear you, but we are eager for it to be interactive. And so I encourage you to submit questions at any point during the proceedings. We will have a question and answer session in the kind of latter period of the event. So the title of the report is Time to Take Responsibility. And we'll be discussing in more detail why it's time for humanitarian organizations to take responsibility in private security contracting and what the challenges are in doing this, how they should go about it, and how they should contract responsible private security providers. I will be putting a link to the policy brief, which we're jointly publishing, in the chat towards the end of the event. You'll also receive it by email, and we will also be publishing a longer report on which this brief is based in the coming days. So please do look out for that. So I am now happy to introduce Leah Moutad, who is research advisor at GISF. Leah is going to provide you with some background about the genesis of this project and why ICoCA and GISF think the issue of private security contracting in the humanitarian sector is an issue that hasn't garnered enough attention, and it deserves more focus, both from the sector itself, as well as from donors and other key stakeholders who may be positively or negatively impacted by the activities of private security providers in humanitarian settings. So I'm going to hand it over to Leah.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. So it won't be a surprise to any of you when I say that aid workers continue to face various threats and attacks. In 2020, 117 aid workers were killed, 242 were seriously wounded, and 125 were kidnapped. And these risks threaten not only the safety of staff, but of entire operations and affected communities. And to continue operating and reach those who need assistance, NGOs need to manage these multiple risks, and sometimes this involves working with private security providers. At GISF, we believe that effective security risk management is based on collaboration, inclusivity, and innovation. As such, we seek to promote informed dialogue so that different actors can learn from each other's expertise. And that's what we have done with ICoCA on this project. I mean, recognizing the place that private security providers have been taking the humanitarian and security sector, GISF had already started to work on the topic since the Montreux document, which was published in 2008. And we produced the first research paper on the use of private security providers by NGOs in 2011. In 2020, we thought to expand and update the work that we had done on this paper. And considering ICoCA's expertise in the matter, we decided to work together to create a module on best practice for contracting private security providers, which we added to our guide, which is called Security to Go, and is now adapted into an online certificate with Disaster Ready, but that's for another time. And the module that we created was really well received by the GISF network. And that's when we realized that we had only touched the tip of the iceberg, if we can say it this way. Before this collaboration, I have to admit that myself, I didn't know much about PSPs, and I basically equated them mostly with armed services, which they aren't. And I was unaware of the diversity of services that they could offer, from supporting context analysis to leading capacity strengthening with local partners and many other services. And the first project that we did really showed us that more research and guidance is needed so that NGOs better understand and manage the risks and opportunities that are related with private security providers. And all of the questions that we had formed the basis of the research project, which has been led by Juliette. And as she will present you her findings and recommendations, I won't say more on the report and policy brief. But the research that we have jointly worked on forms the basis, is aimed at forming the basis of a training guide for procurement of responsible security providers for humanitarian organizations. And I hope that, and I'm sure that you will find it as interesting as we did. It was a real pleasure to work with Juliette and ICoCA throughout. And I think that the recommendations that are presented in the policy brief are a real call for action, and they highlight the importance of improving NGOs' collaboration with PSPs to uphold both the humanitarian principles and mandate. I look forward to hearing more from the panelists and from the audience, and wish you a great webinar.
Thank you, Leah. So it's now my turn. And just before I should say, we're going to have an opportunity, if you've got specific questions after Juliette's presentation on the research findings, we'll have opportunity to answer a few questions then. Please, if you could use the Q&A module to ask your questions rather than the chat, that does help us. So, Juliette Jourde is Research and Outreach Assistant in a jointly funded position between ICoCA and GISF, which Leah's very ably outlined there. Juliette has prior experience working at the Organization of the American States in Colombia, at the Permanent Assembly for Human Rights in Argentina, and with ACTED in Paris. She recently graduated from Sciences Po Paris with a master's in international security and joined us to lead this project. So I am delighted to both congratulate and introduce Juliette today to present an overview of the research and the key findings from the study. Over to you, Juliette.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here really happy to be here. I will just share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Okay, that should be good. Okay, so just before I start, I just really to quickly thank those of you who participated in this study and who made it possible. That was a really interesting process, and I'm really happy to finally share with you the results of those last 6 months of work. So just before I start presenting the findings, I just wanted to flag that we considered in that study a private security provider as any company whose business activities include the provision of security services, either on its own behalf or on the behalf of another, irrespective of how such company describes itself. So it's really the definition of the International Code of Conduct. And so it implies companies providing guarding services, crisis management support, awareness and security training, and so on. So having said that, I just wanted to quickly present you the key steps of this study. So we started by disseminating an online survey to really have a good overview of current private security contracting practices in the humanitarian sector. So we had general questions around internal policies, around selection processes, around working condition of contracted personnel, and so on. So that survey was sent out last July, and we received a total of 83 answers, all anonymous. And they were mainly coming from security staff working in large organizations, so organizations operating in more than 20 countries. And after that phase, we started having some interviews with 16 participants who were interested in discussing this topic further with us. So that was more to obtain kind of more qualitative findings, more different views, different opinions on the issues of the different issues that private security contracting can entail. And we talked with 13 representatives of NGOs, so that's the large majority. One representative coming from an international organization, one from a governmental agency, and one from the private security sector. Then finally, we collected and analyzed all the data we obtained. And so what the survey and interviews allowed us to find is that when it comes to private security contracting, there are 5 main key issues, 5 main key area of concerns. So obviously there are major differences between organizations. They have different experiences, different practices, but those issues are really the ones that were at the center of the majority of testimonies. So I'm going to just introduce them quickly, and then I will come back and explain each of them in more detail, sorry. So the first observation we made is that today humanitarian organizations regularly rely on the services of PSPs, but they are not necessarily equipped to make a really informed decision in that matter. The second aspect is more around budget and cost, which seems to be most often the main driver in the selection process, despite this implying some risk for humanitarian organizations. The third point is more about regulations and the fact that it seems that humanitarian organizations have limited awareness of and make little reference to international standards governing PSPs. The fourth point will touch more on the security concerns and the fact that private security contracting entails major risk for organizations, and it calls for careful risk assessment, an understanding of its impact on acceptance, and effective mitigation measures. So the last point, not to be forgotten, is the whole issue of working conditions of contracted personnel, and especially guards, and the necessity for humanitarian organizations to really invest in the relationship with their providers. So now let's have a look in more detail at each of these findings. So first starting with really the issue of the decision-making process and how and why organizations choose to outsource security instead of having in-house capacities. So that was really clear that it's quite common today to contract PSPs. So 82% of the respondents to the survey said their organization do that. Mainly for unarmed guarding, for the enhancement of the physical protection of premises, for security and awareness training, and crisis management supports. But then in interviews, we were able to discuss in more detail the reasons why organizations choose to do so, and it was clear that there are several advantages PSPs can have: their availability, their cost efficiency, the fact that they can allow to move a certain amount of liability, and so on. But what we saw is that there can be a lack of clarity among organizations on why they really do so. So first, there are 2 issues. First, the fact that they seem not to always question that choice. So is it really more cost efficient? Is it really better for our security and that of our staff? And the second thing is that sometimes it seems that they lack knowledge of the private security sector itself. So who are those companies? Do they have links to other stakeholders? Do they work with subcontractors and so on? So what the study seemed to show is that humanitarian organizations can make the decisions to contract PSPs without having that questioning and that information, and that can be quite problematic for their security, the impact PSPs can have on their program staff, beneficiaries, and host communities. Moving on to the second point, this was big points in interviews and in the survey responses. So many respondents explained that security budgets do not always appear in budget proposals, and that security teams are not always involved in the budget decisions. So they often have to deal with limited resources, and they cannot afford the PSPs with the highest standards and quality, or they can lack the resources to actually do proper security risk assessment, monitor and report on the contracted PSPs. And all of that are factors that were identified as increasing the risk taken by the organizations that contract the PSPs. And I wanted to flag here also another issue that was raised, which is the fact that security teams are not always the ones in charge of contracting and selecting the PSPs. That can be done by administrative or logistic teams. And in those cases, proper security risk assessments are not always conducted. So the third point was a bit more about really the regulations that are used by those organizations. Clearly, the survey showed that many practitioners are actually quite happy with their internal policies and the national regulations they also use to regulate their private security contracting practices. But what we saw is that very few of them, only 5%, actually use the International Code of Conduct as a reference document, and even less, 2%, look at the ICoCA certification when they select a PSP. So even if here there were also major differences among organizations, what we see is an overall lack of engagement with international standards that were not considered as really important or relevant. And another issue that was raised, and that's quite important, is the one of informality, which seems to play an important role at implementation level. And that was particularly the case regarding the issue of contracts, which seems to be better designed for PSPs in particular, and to protect the organizations against the risk those can bring them. And I just wanted to finish with one issue that really remains a gray area. There are more questions than answers on that. Is the one around responsibility and sanctions in cases of misconduct by contracted personnel, and in particular by contracted guards. So here we really call for some additional level of reflection and awareness. But I guess we will be able to discuss that a bit later. And the fourth issue is really more about all the security risk that private security contracting can entail. There was a really high awareness among respondents on those issues, and the study really highlighted the necessity for humanitarian organizations to conduct assessment and evaluation of security, reputational, contractual risk, but also of the potential clashes PSPs can entail with humanitarian principles. And in particular, we had very interesting discussions around acceptance and neutrality, and the necessity for organizations to assess the relationship of the PSPs with the operating environments, and to know how that PSP will impact acceptance either positively or negatively, depending on its behavior, reputation, or links to other stakeholders. What we also saw, and I think Elodie will explain that in more details later, were cases of sexual harassment and abuse by contracted personnel. So that's also something organizations really need to check when selecting a PSP and to monitor through our contracting. Last point that we were able to identify is that it seems that very few organizations actually conduct a specific human rights due diligence, which can be quite problematic considering the duty of care they have toward their staff, toward the contracted personnel, but also towards host communities and beneficiaries. So that's also an area for improvement. And finally, if I can skip, yeah. And finally, the last point, which was also mentioned by the large majority of respondents, is the concerns around guards' working conditions and training level. So that was really clear for many participants that the relationship between the contracting organizations and the PSPs and the contracted personnel is really key in defining what quality of services, what standards the organizations can expect from the PSP. And this relationship is also key, as it will seriously impact security and acceptance for the organizations. So there are two main aspects here. First, the question of salaries and working conditions. So you may be aware that the industry, private security industry, is characterized by low salaries, very long shifts for guards, and sometimes personnel having to take several jobs and so on. So that was clear for many participants that humanitarian organizations should really guarantee the respect of the labor rights of their contracted personnel. And this not only for security reasons, a good environment, good security and so on, but also because they have that duty of care towards them. And that was quite clear also in interviews. And the second aspect of that relationship relates more to the training and the integration of contracted personnel to the organization. And that's a particular area of concern because of the role guards can play in acceptance. They are often the first faces people see at the gates of organizations. So they really need to be trained on their organization's mandates, mission, operating procedures, code of conduct, and of course, humanitarian principles and acceptance strategies. So that was really the last point, and I think if Debat joins, he will be able to tell us a bit more about his experiences in Côte d'Ivoire. So that were the 5 main findings we were able to make thanks to the survey and the interviews, and thanks to your participations. You will be able to read about them a bit more in detail in the longer report we will eventually publish when it will be ready. Oh, I have a sunshine in the face now. And I wanted just to thank you for your attention, and I will answer any question you may have on the findings.
Great, thank you so much, Juliet. So, as you can see from that presentation, Juliet's research really has unearthed a deep, rich set of data and findings on which we can really do follow-up work and engage with humanitarian actors as well as the private security sector on these issues. We are going to get perspectives from both humanitarian organizations and the private security industry in our panel discussion in a few moments' time, but I did want to give opportunity to open it up to some specific questions that people might have for Juliet on the research. And so thank you for submitting these. We're getting a few coming in. So if we can just take the first one. We have the first question: did the research find out why most humanitarian organizations argue that they didn't budget for PSP services like man guarding or crisis support or physical risk assessment? I'm going to hand over each of these to Juliet. She was doing the research.
Okay, so on the question of the budget, I guess there were several issues. First, some interviewees thought that sometimes security staff are not always trained to properly budget their need and to advocate for that to their managers. So it would be like first the issue at kind of field level of assessing the real needs and asking management for specific budgets. And then the issue is also at the level of proposals and donors. Security budget often seems to be under administrative lines. So not specific to security and therefore not considering private security contracting needs. But yeah, that's I don't think there's an only reason. I'm sorry, I don't really see my screen now. There's not one reason for that, but yeah, an overall lack of consideration for security budgets in the whole functioning of organization, and then donors, and then proposals. And then also security teams are not always involved in program planning. So program teams may be in charge of it, and they just neglect the need for contracted personnel. And in that case, well, security teams end up with no budget for ensuring security with PSPs.
There is a related question that's come in, Juliet. I don't know whether any of your interviewing unearthed answers to this or the survey itself, but that Andrew Fark asks, there seems to be a reluctance to take on larger providers, security providers, which some do have ICoCA membership, mainly due to cost. Do the findings of this research support that idea?
I think it really depends on the type of organization, because some participants coming from smallest organization would say so, but other with big security needs, they were more saying that only big providers can meet their requirements. So international, multinational PSPs and so on. So that really depends on, one, the context and the market, and two, the needs of the organization. But there was no clear trend in that sense.
And we got a question from Paul Glynn, which is, can we confirm which departments in the organization are involved in the surveys? For example, procurement, finance, or security management? And I'm going to preempt your answer because we're working with GISF and the GISF membership. I think there is a preponderance for that to be security managers. But Juliet, could you confirm that that's the case, and what the implications of that might be?
Mm-hmm. Well, the huge majority of respondents to both the survey and interviews were working in the security departments of their organization. So that both great, because they had super interesting views on the topic, and that's also a potential bias, because well, we don't have the views of teams working in procurement, program, or HR or admin that can also be involved in the contracting process. So that's something we were aware of, and we flagged in the final reports, because the views that were expressed in interviews, in the survey, and the conclusions we made are mainly do not necessarily reflect the views of whole different humanitarian workers.
There's a question, Juliet, on the geographic findings, and we did do some work at the beginning to think about, okay, which countries do we want to include, but were there any findings that came out that particularly highlight countries where there may be unfortunate treatment of security guards, or likewise, other human rights violations?
So I had the opportunity to chat with people coming from different region and different countries, and very different dynamics in each of those regions. So for instance, Latin America, it seemed that private security contracting is quite common. There's not that much issue with that. African countries tending to have more, interviewees coming from there tended to highlight more those issues of working conditions and poor salaries, and the necessity really for organizations to really check in contract and with the PSPs and with the contracted personnel if the salaries were sent and so on. So I would say, yeah, the main area focus for those kind of issues was the African region. But then, yeah, I guess we would need a much larger sample to have a real comparison between regions. Sorry.
So we have a question here. We've got lots of questions coming in, which is great. I might not tackle them all in this segment, because I think we do want to get onto the panel discussion, and I'm sure some of these issues will come out there. There is another kind of budgeting question. I will ask this one on the budgeting, because obviously it seems to be a kind of a thread. And this is important, is did you get a sense that the lack of security funding comes from the NGOs' lack of funding for that need, or from donor reluctance to support such funding?
Maybe both, I would say. Well, definitely both were expressed in interviews and in the survey responses. But I would say also, and that's something that was highlighted, maybe I think Elodie will talk a bit about that, but donors' misconceptions around security needs and around private security contracting also. There's maybe a need here to really discuss why in certain instances security teams believe they need PSPs and to protect what, and also in relation to program continuity and so on. So there seems to have a poor understanding from the part of donors regarding those specific needs. And then, of course, the issue of limited resources is just, well, it's the issue of humanitarian NGOs in general, and especially for security. Many respondents were also explaining to me that their departments are very new. So it's only security departments existing for some years, and that developing and making management understand their needs in terms of budgets is quite still a challenge.
Thank you. And there's one final kind of point on this. It's a comment, not a question, in the Q&A, but I will kind of finish this budget question on a positive note, perhaps, and that is from Sabuhai, who says security from outset can be a solution here if the security is in the scope of the initial project program risk assessment. Then budgeting can be factored into overall program budget. So that's not requiring a response, but I think we would agree that's a good approach. Now, I do want to turn now, and I know we've still got questions here unanswered, but I think we're going to get to some of these during the kind of panel discussion and Q&A afterwards. So I want to bring in our panelists into the discussion. I am going to give you a kind of a brief introduction to each of them, and then I will pass over for a kind of an interjection, a 5-minute discussion, reflection on what's come out in this paper, the things that Juliet's commented on. So our first panelist is Elodie Leroy-Le. She is Global Security Advisor for Plan International and is based at Plan International's UK HQ. In addition to her operation role, Elodie is currently developing Plan International's Security for All strategy, promoting an intersectional approach to security risks management. Prior to working with Plan International, Elodie worked in several high-risk countries with various international NGOs and UN agencies, funds and programs as humanitarian access coordinator, security manager, security analyst, and chief of security unit. Elodie is a former Navy officer and holds a Naval Academy diploma and master's in law. And Elodie was one of the willing participants in this research project. And so I'm going to hand it over now to Elodie for her kind of reflections in her role, especially, you know, managing a global security unit for a large humanitarian organization on you know, the findings that we've just heard about, and her reflections on that. So Elodie, over to you.
Thank you very much. No, I think that this analyses are very interesting, and I had to put forward things that we already know. And it's interesting to see the question, also question from the private sector, because I think that one of the main issues we have is sometimes there is a discrepancy between and sometimes a lack of communication between humanitarian actors and private security providers. when there is security advisors and when the security unit or security department in an NGO is quite strong, it's easier to have like proper discussion. But at country office level, it might not be the case because we will have only one security advisor or only security focal point. And the capacity of the security focal point of the senior management team in managing security might differ from one country to another. But the other things that will perhaps hinder our relation with private security contractor is sometimes also that some private security contractor have I won't say weak idea, but doesn't have a strong idea or knowledge of what humanitarian, what is the need of humanitarian actors in terms of security, what we need in terms of security management and security provider. Because one thing that is very interesting, very important to have in mind, and it's a problem that we have also internally, is to understand how we build security as humanitarian. And security as humanitarian is in most part what we call soft security. It doesn't mean that we will not have a guards manager. In some organization I used to work with, UN agencies, in very high risk area, we had some private security with armed guard, which is not very, very often the case. But mainly we rely on the fact that the population knows us, that we have member of the community in every area. So it's mean if we have to discuss with non-state armed group, we will discuss with non-state armed group. And if we have to have a relay inside this community that work with non-state armed group, we will discuss with them. So the thing that the way we deal with our reputation, the way we deal with people we interact with has a very important role in the security, in how we'll be perceived and how the threat will materialize, how what risk we may have, and that's why contracting private security partner is sometimes difficult, because the question is that, okay, what will be the consequences for me? If this organization is working with several other organizations, because as a private security provider, the idea is not to work only with humanitarian organizations, but sometimes to work with other private companies. What will be the consequences for me? There is also the question of, because often, and what is funny is that I see that from the private sector, lots of people think that humanitarian doesn't use private security contractor. And from other humanitarian side, some things like, oh, we use too much private security contractor, we use too much guard company, it's too much. So you see, it's kind of interesting. And one of the things that often people use private security partners as a transfer of risk and transfer of liability. Which for me is kind of a myth, because you will not transfer the reputational risk of your organization if it's a member of the guards that you hired or a company that you hired that will have a misbehavior or that will be involved with, for example, pro-government in areas that are anti-government and you work with, or the contrary. And that's something that must be really thoroughly discussed when we contract a private security contractor. It should be really discussed and not just like, okay, let's hire the most cost efficient. Because the idea is to say, like, whatever happens with a guard that is working for us, with a security contractor that is working for us, it will have an impact on our security, it will have an impact on our reputation. And that's very important to stop with this kind of, oh, it's a transfer of risk and liability, because it's not. So that's an important point. But on the other way, sometimes people say, oh, no, we cannot use this private security contractor because he will be a liability because of our reputational risk, because it's against humanitarian principle. Not always. It will really depend on who is the organization you work with, what is their implementation in the area you work with, and what are their relations within the community. And how you make a link between these people that work for you, that you contract, and your mandate and mission, and how you integrate them as being part of your team. And this is mostly important because, and you say something very important, Juliette, is about what's in it for a staff, what is the risk associated with hiring private security. What is the risk for us and what is the risk for our staff? And often we talk about reputational risk, we talk about humanitarian principle, but something that we often forget is gender-based violence and the risk for especially our women staff. And it's very important because it's something that I have seen with other organizations I used to work with when we used to do women security awareness training, and we gathered lots of data in different UN organizations. But we did the same with Plan International, gathering a maximum of information from a maximum of staff. We had more than 700 women who participated to our consultation to have a better idea on what were the main security concerns. And one of the things that came out very often was the fact that there was the fear of staying late at night and being assaulted by security guards, because it happens, not just because they're afraid of this, but because it has happened. And it's really something that is often never discussed. And there is often never and it's our fault also. It's really like a shared responsibility between the company and the organization to have a proper discussion and say, okay, if this were to happen, this is how we will do. This is how, as an humanitarian organization, we will work. And this is what will be our way of working. What we recommend, for example, is that what we explain is to discuss with the company owner or the company manager and explain clearly if there is any complaint from a woman, we will believe the woman and we will ask the guard to be removed. And if it were to happen, then we might, we put it into the contract so that we can cancel the contract. And it's something that is very important because it's not one company that misbehaves. It's not one country office or one organization, one humanitarian organization that has this problem. It's something that is really systemic and that is widespread. And for me, the main way to address it is to recognize it and to have real practice around that. So that was mainly what I wanted to emphasize. And that pushed the question, on when you have a lot of turnover, and that's what you say also, Juliette, about the salary, for example. When we say that it's most efficient to have private security partners, yes, it can be more efficient because you have a lot of people who are trained, who know their job, and we can adapt quickly to what you need. But at the same time, if you have people that are not correctly paid, it created lots of turnover, and then it generates additional risk for your staff, especially for your female staff. When, for example, you have guards in front of guest house, female guest house, and every now and then, every 2 or 3 weeks, the guard is changing, and you have to rebrief them, and the woman doesn't know who is this guy in front of her door all night, then you have a potential breach in your security system. So that's all what I wanted to emphasize from my side.
Thank you so much, Elodie. It's really fascinating. And I did just want to ask, one follow-up question, and I encourage everybody to keep submitting those questions. But one follow-up question to you on this, and that is that you are a woman. You are the head of global security at Plan International. But security is often seen as a kind of masculine occupation, and many private security companies are predominantly male, guard forces. I wonder whether this issue is maybe not well addressed if so much of the kind of professional workforce focused on security are men. I wonder whether you've kind of come across that, because I know that you've very kind of clearly brought this up as a major issue in our discussions with you. But many of the men in security roles don't see this. And so what are the challenges around that? And it kind of maybe perhaps links to your first point on the capacity of security management teams. How are security management teams recruited? What is the profile of people that humanitarian organizations are bringing in? Is it diverse enough? What more perhaps can be done on that front?
No, it's a really good question, and actually we try to think of how can we work on that based on our experience. And what we did is that we asked the women, actually, how will you feel comfortable with the guard? How will you think that we should address this? And some of the main recommendations were like, we should be able to decide together which guards we trust, and that we will say, okay, we are in for these guards to be on the night shift, for example. So that can be simple discussion as that. The people that women feel safe, and the majority of women say, okay, we feel safe with this guard, we keep him. The second thing is clear discussion, because when you have a clear discussion, with the guard and the guard manager, and say like, if there is any woman who complains about it, it will be off. Already it put the things that we believe the women, there will be no gray area or anything. We will believe the women because we know that 95% of the case, what they will be reporting will be true. So we'd rather be on the safe side than leaving our staff, uncared for. And the last thing, but that ask us question, because we want to have an increased number of female guards, and it's possible in lots of areas. But the idea is that if you have only one female guard, for example, for a night shift, in where there is like 5 guards, in your company, and there is only one female guard, then again, you do a transfer of risk between your female staff in Plan International or in other organization to the female guards from private contractor. And because she might be also exposed to risk with her colleagues, which is a reality also, we need to have a clear discussion about that. That is a reality, that the risk of sexual assault and harassment, especially in men-dominated sector when you are a minority as a man, is a real risk. So the idea is not to transfer the risk either. So it's something that needs a more long-term discussion, in order to address that. And how we have pushed a lot on this women and security consultation, but what we have done also to put that into the mind and the perspective of people is that in every training that we do, should it be the HIT training, because we have our own internal HIT training, so should it be the HIT training or security focal point capacity building, or the capacity building of our regional security advisor, we always put this into perspective. We always add this perspective so that they always have it in mind every time they do a security risk assessment, every time they hire a private contractor. But this is like what should be the best things, But I really believe that after in control office, something like that, things there is a lot of room for improvement. But I really believe one of the things that is missing a lot is a discussion between the private contractor and the security advisors at every level. Because often security advisors have, similar background than the private security. And so they can find the bridge to understand each other in what are their needs based on the specific mandate as humanitarian actors. So I think it's also something that we both need to work on.
Thank you. And this is certainly an area that ICoCA has been putting a lot of focus on over the last couple of years. We produced a guidance on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse a couple of years ago, and we followed that up this year with an online training course on the same topic, which has been well received by our member and affiliate companies, and is clearly filling a gap. This issue is not well covered within the the kind of curricula of even the larger organizations. But we've had a great perspective there from a large international. You had one more thing to say. Yeah,
I'm sorry, just because you said something, I remember one of the most important thing is whatever the guard, if the guard is like you hired, because some organization hire their own guard, and sometimes it's relevant to have your own guard that is under your own payroll, and it can be utterly relevant to have that, or to have private security. It really depends on the security risk assessment and everything. But whatever, if they are contracted or not, what is the most important is to make them feel part of the team. And that is not only by talking to them, but it's also, for example, in Somalia, what we did is that we provided them with a risk insurance that the company was not providing, but us as an organization, we provided them with a risk insurance so that should they be hurt in performing their duty, their family would be covered, for example. And we provided them with protective jacket and protective helmet and everything. So that at one point, they feel that they are part of the team and that we are caring for them. And it's this kind of stuff that also this sense of we care for you, you are part of the team, also brings, an additional value in the fact that the guards will be more willing to behave correctly and to protect the staff they are supposed to protect. So that was the last point I wanted to say.
Sure, and the duty of care should not be seen just as a legal concept. It should be embedded in the culture of organizations. But I want to turn now to, we've had great perspective from an organization that is contracting private security providers. I wanted now to turn to one that doesn't so much. And so I'd like to introduce Fodeba Diallo. Fodeba is the current Regional Disaster Risk Management Coordinator for the Red Cross in Côte d'Ivoire, as well as the Safety and Security Officer of the Red Cross Local Committee in Bouaké. He has worked for the Red Cross in Côte d'Ivoire for more than 9 years and has pushed the development of a security department and security skills and capacities at the national level. So Fodeba, it would be great to get your insights on this research, particularly from the perspective of an organization that chooses not to contract private security providers. Why is that? And what do you see in the Côte d'Ivoire context that is changing? And that includes, more humanitarian organizations perhaps that do choose to contract private providers, and what are the implications for your organization with that happening? But over to you. And just a quick word to everybody, Fodeba will be speaking in French. So if you don't speak French, please be sure to check the English icon in interpretation. Fodeba.
D'accord. Merci bien. Merci encore une fois.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for this interesting panel. And the Red Cross Côte d'Ivoire, we decided not to contract the PSP because during the crisis in our country, we noticed that most of the PSP were paid by high military officials or high governmental officials working in the security level. And we were in the sieged region occupied by the rebellions, and therefore we had more PSP which were established by military officials present in the area, while in our company we preferred to recruit in-house staff, and we recruited among the volunteers. It was important to take local staff, and especially volunteering staff who are, aware of the humanitarian issues. They have their own connections in the regions, especially compared to a private security. So these people can better guide the organization while implementing their projects. Therefore, we privileged, as I said, the in-house recruitment. We take volunteers or we hire our local staff because the people in the regions will be more comfortable to work and can also give a better image within their community. For instance, in Mali, many humanitarians are assaulted, and now though we have less risk compared to Central Africa, where you have more assaults and killings. So here we prefer to take local staff. This decreases the risk and have a better image for the organization. It allows also the organization to better control the actions in the field. We focus more on local staff and not on PSPs. The second element in Bouaké city, this is a concrete example. So there were operations, and even UN agencies contracted PSPs. The problem, though, the UN organization paid the PSP, but the PSP did not provide decent salaries to the staff, and the UN had to impose a minimum salary to the guards because the PSP didn't comply with the basic levels of salaries or insurance for their staff or other benefits. And these are important for the staff, because when someone has an insurance policy and when the family also is insured, especially the children, and at the age of 18, the guards will be more motivated to protect and to defend the organization within the community. Also, it facilitates the access of the organization within the community, of course, compared to other organizations which contracted the PSP, because we said that the PSP didn't comply with the working conditions, with the salary standards, and sometimes we had a guard that we wanted to deploy in the UN side. He had to pay one salary month to his supervisor to be part of that region or of that site. So the UN operation decided to put some pressure in order to impose a minimum salaries to the PSP, and they had changed. Finally, the UN agency had to resort to large security company which were based in Côte d'Ivoire. The third point I wanted also to raise was to really to emphasize the fact of not using armed guards. The fact
ça nous a facilité nos actions sur le terrain.
Facilitated our operations on site. The fact that to hire local staff was even facilitating the work, and so we had to face less challenges by taking local staff, since they know the area. And when we recruit, we also try to comply with the working conditions, as well as with the minimum salary, the insurance policy, to give also a coverage for the whole family, and also to provide paid leaves. And also we need to ensure trainings. Today, with the High Commission for Refugees, we are developing a security focal point in Côte d'Ivoire, because you know that the security situation of Côte d'Ivoire is quite challenging. Before the electoral campaign, and the development of the focal point can go even to the border, where they have also some terrorist attacks, and it is important to train our staff. As I said, that they were volunteering from the Red Cross, and they need to be trained to avoid any incidents on the borders, while PSP in the West areas, they work with the units which comply with the working conditions. This is a very important factors which was identified during my research. As I said, in Mali, they had some problems to recruit, and they preferred to contract the biggest companies because they go in compliance with the standards. As for the local PSPs, as I said, that they are established mainly by military officials or governmental officials. Therefore, they do not comply with the working conditions, and they don't comply with the contracts of the staff that will be deployed. It will be crucial for those companies, especially with regard to the experience of Côte d'Ivoire, with the experience of the Red Cross in Côte d'Ivoire. It's really to recruit local guard and avoid armed guards. This should be the last resort. So the UN agency deployed armed guards for night shifts, because we consider that it's at night that there are more insecurity risk in the area. So it is very important to emphasize or to insist on the compliance and the respect of the contractual provisions, and we need to create a kind of respect agreement in case the humanitarian organizations need to recruit PSPs. It is important to create a kind of charter or a kind of contract that will connect the NGO with the PSP, and which should comply with the provisions, notably the working conditions. It is also important, this is what I observed with locally, it is important that the country managers or the regional managers of INGOs or the HROs or those who deal with PSP contracts, it's important that they communicate with the guards so that they can be informed about the working conditions of the guards. So this is roughly what I wanted to say, and the work that we conducted with LOD. So again, insist on the fact, on the use of armed guards. In the Red Cross, again, we preferred to have volunteers and non-armed guards. As for the military guards, are also recruited locally because they have their own connections. They local guards can also better disseminate the information and can better implement the project in the area. This is globally what I wanted to share with you and with the panelists. Thank you. I'll be available to answer your questions.
Well, thank you so much for that, Fadeba. It's great to get that perspective, and clearly the kind of the messages there are to recruit local and don't arm your guards. And in fact, you know, armed guarding is obviously very little used across the humanitarian sector, only in a very small number of circumstances through, you know, the research that we've done. But I would say that you know, that does not reduce risk in many instances, and maybe Elodie, we could you know, say something a little later about the fact that we're talking about sexual exploitation and abuse. Well, you don't need a gun to sexually harass staff, to sexually abuse staff, and so not being armed does not reduce risk. I would be interested. There's a question that's come in, but I think it links to John. And also for Fadeba, I do want to kind of ask, when you provide this is the question that's coming from Grant Brigden, when you provide your own security, do you uphold and maintain the same standards, reporting and certifications prescribed by ICoCA. And so there are a number of international standards that we work in parallel with. And if so, who do you report that to? And are you audited by third parties? If you could just say a very quick 2 minutes, if there is any kind of auditing or kind of external verification on the kind of quality management of internal security provision.
Is that for me, Chris?
That was for Fadeba, but just a very quick answer because time is pressing.
Généralement, il faut le dire.
Generally speaking, in Côte d'Ivoire, we didn't take, I mean, the importance it's the department that was the security department that is aware of that. And unfortunately, we don't have any external audit in the field of security. It's only the last month where the High Commission for Refugees started to do some trainings, but the external audit shall be carried out by the company. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have any external audit in order to give a specific, to have a specific evaluation in order to know how to manage our staff. I think that this recommendation is going to be reported to the governance and to the top management, and it will be interesting to have an external observation and in order to better monitor our services. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So I do want to turn now to somebody who knows a thing or two about audit and certification. John Davis is Director and Country Manager of Arta International Limited, based in Juba in South Sudan. Arta is an affiliate, an ICoCA affiliate company that provides security and risk services to a wide range of clients in South Sudan. And for the past 10 years, John's worked in South Sudan, DRC, Tanzania, Somalia, and Kenya on the senior executive team of a major regional risk and security company before he launched Arta in February of 2019. He's personally set up and administered several quality management systems. And in 2017, he was elected to the board of the International Code of Conduct Association, ICoCA, as a director of the security industry pillar. So John, as somebody who has worked for humanitarian organizations and works for humanitarian organizations, they're your clients, some of them, it would be great to get your perspective from a private security provider, and particularly Fadeba there has mentioned the importance of recruiting local, and Arta is a local company in South Sudan. So can we get your perspective on the research that we've done and on the report?
Yeah, certainly. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, and hello. Good day, everybody from Juba in South Sudan. And as Chris has said, I've been asked to provide a little perspective from the view of a security service provider. My company, Arta, operates in the youngest country in the world, and for a variety of reasons, there remain significant challenges here requiring the involvement of humanitarian organizations, which form the majority of our clients. Companies like ours don't just provide guards or security officers, I prefer to call them. We deliver a full range of supporting services that fall under the umbrella of risk management. This can take the form of either full or part-time specialists to assist teams or the undertaking of specific tasks. Our security managers can provide local knowledge to enable an organization to navigate local idiosyncrasies and most effectively deliver its programs. And with that comes a number of value adds from this type of engagement that could be something as simple as understanding the immigration and permit rules, which here can be subject to change with very little notice. And we understand the landscape. So we treat such an engagement very much as a partnership with our clients. From the security officer manning the gate we've referred to a specialist offering vital contributions to the decision-making process. So referencing the excellent report and the work that's been done, obviously due diligence is vital. And the basics such as regulatory compliance and demonstrable experience are non-negotiable. And just for context here, there are currently in South Sudan some 77 registered private security providers, would you believe? However, I'm given to understand that perhaps as few as 5 have a physical office. So with my background with the association, I obviously concur with the recommendations of the report that respect for and alignment with international standards is absolutely key and crucial to mitigate the perceived incompatibility of the work that we undertake with humanitarian principles. And I understand why that can be perceived as such. But I firmly believe that done in the right way, our work is not only compatible, but can contribute to an organization's good reputation. So I fully support the need for standards and affiliation with ICoCA. As the report highlights, organizations need to understand how a PSP embraces the key aspects of service delivery. And all of the headline areas, including training and vetting, rules of force, and the whole human rights piece are covered by the code of conduct, and the recognized standards, in our case, 18788 and PSC 1. It's been said in these forums, it was said today even, that security officers are almost always the first person an outsider will meet when visiting a compound. So we see ourselves as an extension of our client's organization. Standards ensure that security officers are trained in all the relevant areas, customer care, how to interact with agency staff and external parties, and of course, orientation in all forms of human rights. Just anecdotally, we've started to deliver the ICoCA training in PSEA, which we found particularly useful. And it became very apposite when I was recently called into the head of a prominent NGO here and asked specifically if our security officers were in a position to recognize such types of abuse. And it was clearly a hot topic, and I felt empowered to support my client by virtue of affiliation with ICoCA. Further consider, and again, this came up with Elodie, that our security officers often protect residences, and there are certain intimacies attached with that. Our personnel are protecting you and your property while you sleep. And so this very much keyed in with the earlier comments. I was happy to see in the report reference to working conditions. It's also come up earlier in this discussion. I've long been involved with trying to effect change by arguing the benefits of improved shifts on morale and the efficacy of service provision. But despite significant gains, we still find the majority of RFPs indicating shift patterns of 12 hours for a 6-day week, which is brutal. And bidders seldom, if ever, have the opportunity to offer alternatives due to the competitive nature of the bid process. And that's probably something that needs to be discussed. So wrapping up, a couple of recommendations I would encourage during PSP selection. The first relates to duty of care, which was mentioned earlier, and that is the medical treatment of staff. Medical benefits contribute significantly to morale and motivation, but moreover, an organization can take comfort knowing that its security officers are in good health, fit to carry out their duties, and in less danger of spreading diseases. And the final point, which has also come up today, is to reiterate a finding in the report that PSPs should demonstrate as far as possible their independence from any government organs or individuals that may bring undue influence to bear on the way its operations are conducted. This does happen, as we've heard. It happens here. Diligence should be exercised. That's all for me, and many thanks to ICoCA for the opportunity of contributing to this very important conversation.
Thank you, John. I do want to ask a follow-up question because you've brought up the importance of human rights due diligence there. And so I want to hear, I'd be interested to hear from you, from your side of the table, as a provider, you know, have you been impressed, or what are your impressions of the human rights due diligence that humanitarian organizations are doing on their private security providers?
That's a difficult one, because quite often that kind of diligence is undertaken during presumably the sort of bid process, the internal bid process within the organization. So we don't get to see a lot of that. However, we do often get visits from people seeking services. I have to say, honestly, that the human rights ticket does not come up particularly often in the questions that we're asked. They tend to be more looking at licenses and approvals, our capacity, how many clients we've got, what sort of clients we have. But if I'm honest, I don't specifically get asked questions on human rights, and it's often us who are singing the praises of ICoCA and this important area of human rights, and using that as our USP when we're bidding to and pitching to clients.
And you know, of course, ICoCA is doing due diligence on all of their member and affiliate companies, and so when an organization chooses to contract an affiliate or member company, they can be assured that human rights due diligence is being conducted. But Elodie, I'd be interested to get your perspective as a user of private security, and I want to link this to a question from Andrew Farquhar, because in some contexts there may not be any members or affiliates of ICoCA present. It may not be possible to contract an ICoCA member company. We do, of course, hope to change that, and I will just say that to make sure that there are more. We know that what drives membership in the association is when organization in their tenders. That is what drives private security companies to join, and they may not be you know, member and affiliate companies of ICoCA. What are the challenges for your organization, Elodie, of doing that kind of human rights due diligence on private security providers?
It will depend on each country, actually, because we can have issue internally in terms of capacity, in terms of like even knowing that ICoCA does exist, you know, and being able to search correctly and to get the right information. And to check, you know, because there is a difference between checking a first time, but like checking regularly to assess whether or not the company has changed, because it's also something that we have faced. For example, you have like one company owner and the quality of the service and human rights are being respected, and then suddenly you have a change in the management, for example, and there is a change of the way, or the company can be bought, you know, again, and then there is change of how the company works, and we have seen that quite often. So I think there is a lack of knowledge. I don't know if you can hear me, but I think there is a general lack of knowledge certainly within the humanitarian sector of ICoCA standard. But I think there is also sometimes a bit of a mistrust in the capacity to assess and to be sure that if it has been assessed once, what's the situation 1 year later, 6 months later, 2 months later. And I think there is also something linked to that. And in area where there is no ICoCA or nothing like that, I believe that sometimes we must also ask our question, and I really go back to what Fodeba said. Outsourcing is not always the best solution. It can be a good solution, especially when you need an important number of guards and then you don't have the capacity to manage them, or if you need some like crisis, some special crisis intervention team or something like that, it can have an interest. But sometimes outsourcing is not interesting, especially in an area where you have only one security company, or you are not very sure of what they are providing and how you can check on them and how you can really check what are the internal affiliation. And in such case, it's better to hire your own guards, because the way we do security in the humanitarian sector is something very important to understand. Security is completely embedded and linked to the way we deliver our program and to the way we deliver our program, but from support to program delivery to work with the community. So when, as Fodeba said, we have our guards internally, they are a member of our team. They will also be like some kind of speakers to the community. They will be the one who can diffuse tension, that can relay some message, including to non-state armed group that they might have a cousin that work for, or they might have worked with non-state armed group. And it's not a problem to us because we know it. The idea for us, like, who do we have in part of our organization that can be in, like, from the support to the program implementation, can help enable it. So it's important because you cannot separate program management and program implementation and all the soft security around that, all the community acceptance, to the way we manage our security and to our security team. If it's not embedded, it doesn't work. So it's also very important to understand that when you work with a humanitarian organization, because that's what we are searching, and that's why sometimes we are very cautious with private and independent security contractors, because it's how we make them match together.
Yeah, and I mean, one comment on the kind of monitoring and verification there, and that, if an audit is done once, certification audits are done every 3 years. We do an annual company assessment, which is done on an annual basis. But of course, we can't be there, the eyes and ears on the ground, 365 days. But that, I think, is where, clients, including humanitarian organizations, play such a key role as well in the management and oversight of providers, by simple things like, checking that the guards are getting paid what they were contracted to be paid in an agreement. If that's not the case, then that needs following up on. Fodeba, I wanted to kind of bring you back in just on this point of hiring local again versus contracting out to providers. And so it would be interesting to know whether you've seen in the Côte d'Ivoire context any kind of cases or issues where by contracting out, humanitarian organizations have maybe suffered some consequences from getting embroiled perhaps in local politics or whatever it might be, not from the necessarily perspective of the Red Cross, although that may have impacted the Red Cross as well.
Ici, nous, on n'a pas eu de problème particulier.
Not really. We did not have any specific problem in Bouaké, but compared in the west of Côte d'Ivoire and in our offices there, we faced challenges because the recruited guards were not volunteers. And with the departure of the CICR, and as you know, the Red Cross offices differ from one country to another, and locally they had some difficulties to manage the salary of guards. And the guards stayed for 2 years later, they placed a case before the court. They went to the courts for non-paid salaries. While compared to our regions, we had some financial problems to pay the guards of our office, but he was paid for 3 and 4 years. He was a volunteer, and he received a fixed salary for 4 years, even though we had the problems to pay his salary on a regular basis. He did, and also in indemnity when he had to quit and he didn't go to court. So I gave you this example because he was a volunteer staff. He was familiar with the company, and for him to complain against the office could be considered to be a betrayal. So just to say, when you recruit an external PSP, you could have a negative impact in large companies. Of course, this will not happen. It's very rare to have financial problems to pay the salary of their security staff. Here, of course, it's a national unit, and each area has its own autonomy. And whenever we have difficulties to pay the card, and if there are recruited volunteers in-house, it's manageable. However, for an external staff, of course, they will go to court if they are not paid. This is, though it's not our objective to recruit staff and not to pay them, but we could face this problem. I repeat, and what I advise, what I would like to recommend during the recruitment of guards, it's important to recruit local staff, because in Côte d'Ivoire, when you have in-house staff, you have less incidents, because PSP do not comply with human rights obligations. They don't respect the salary conditions, the working conditions, because PSPs use these contracts and they don't pay correctly their staff. And instead of providing them all the benefits, health benefits, etc., I mean, they take the money, and this is quite a common practice. Most of the PSP do not also comply with human rights obligations. Next, since the PSP are not paying correctly the salary, you will see that they have lots of turnover, which will create more risks, because this is a new staff, not well trained, we don't know their past, and if he's poorly paid, he can, you know, do bad things against the organization. And we need to be very careful on the working condition. We need to be careful on the social situation of the staff within the PSP. So this is basically my conclusions and my comments on that.
Thank you for that. And we are now out of time, but I do feel like I need to just pass the mic over to John very briefly, because, you know, that's a broad brush, and there are very obviously issues with many PSPs in this space, but they're not all bad actors. And you know, we work with some authentic companies who are absolutely authentically looking to raise their game and respect human rights. And so I just want to pass the mic over quickly to John and a kind of reaction to that, and maybe a reflection on how standards across the private security sector may be raised.
Well, that's very kind of you, Chris. Yes, and I mean, I'm sorry to hear some of Fordeba's experiences. I would say in our part of the world, certainly in terms of labor and labor law, you know, in Central and East Africa, labor ministries are very, very strong, and so there isn't the remotest chance of trying not to pay people what they're due and not to pay their benefits or their terminal dues, because people have redress to ministries. They're very strong. I don't know if that's a throwover from colonial administrations, or so there isn't really that that problem. The problem I see is a question of working conditions, of shift patterns, of an acceptance that guards have to work for 12 hours a day, for 6 days a week, on a brutal shift pattern, have one day off and do it all over again. And for me, that's the biggest game changer, if we could all come together, because we work in a marketplace. And so we can't be a lone voice on this. We've got to come together, and perhaps the association is, is the platform or the forum to broaden this type of conversation. That'll bring up the standards without question.
And that is certainly something that is high up on our agenda. We are looking at how we can engage with clients across all sectors, not just humanitarian organizations, but in the corporate sector, governments as well, who contract private security, that clients have a responsibility, they have a duty of care to those suppliers, to their supply chain, to those people that they contract. Organizations wouldn't ask their own staff to work a 12-hour shift 6-7 days a week, and so they shouldn't be doing that of their private security providers. But listen, we are out of time today. I want to thank all our panelists for this really fantastic discussion. I want to congratulate Juliet again on some great work. It's not finished yet. We will be turning next to a training module on responsible private security contracting, which we're working on with GISF. I have put a link to the policy brief in the chat. So I encourage you all to click on that link, have a read, please share it around with your professional networks. We'll be emailing the PDF to you all as well. And I'm not going to try and summarize the conversation that we've had today, but the work that we do on ensuring that human rights are respected across all sectors continues, and we look forward to continuing to engage with the humanitarian sector on these important issues. But today, thanks everybody.